What do we mean by deep? We know it when we see it, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't have a definite meaning. It's an abstract notion, and it's entered colloquial usage as a blanket term to encompass many striking or interesting observations, metaphors, stories, and so on. However, I've had in mind a particular theory regarding this concept for a while, which I'd like to share. I don't propose to specify a definition of the word, but rather some of the conditions that I believe are necessary for an observer to perceive this type of depth. Condition 1. The target effect must be to depict, comment on, or recontextualize human experience. First, let's consider an example that made me contemplate this subject for the first time. It's contained in this video by Just Right, great channel. It's on Game of Thrones, and in the video, they mention that the Night King and his army of White Walkers are a metaphor for climate change. Now, I haven't watched Game of Thrones and I don't know what goes on in the show, but I'll take their word for it. They proceed to say that the metaphor arises because the warring factions of nobles can be seen as analogous to the internal, relatively petty strife and disunity by which the human population is beset, and by which it's crippled in the face of larger, existential threats like climate change, against which humankind needs to unite, the same way that these factions of nobles need to unite against the Night King. Makes sense? Sounds cool. Anyways, what I'd like to highlight is that this perspective of climate change deals heavily in humanity. It concerns itself primarily with the manifestation of human nature more than with the empirical fact of climate change as considered independently of humanity. In other words, this is a human perspective. That is, a perspective that's rooted in facets of human nature, human experience, or human emotions. Taking it this way, it's easy to see what a non-human perspective could look like. Say, for instance, on the topic of climate change, this. Okay, so this is a representation of climate change. This is a perspective of climate change. The perspective we just discussed, the one behind the metaphor, is also a perspective of climate change. But this one's a more statistical perspective, and its anchors in human experience are much more tenuous. And I think we can all agree that this perspective does not at all approach as close to depth, whatever that may be, as the previous one. So a correlation can be observed here. Let's look at another case. Okay, now this is another representation, and this representation is just as far removed from any notions of depth as this one. However, it's indisputable that this image invokes human psychological associations with colors to paint a more intuitive and compelling picture of the effects of climate change. Why, then, does it fall short of depth? I believe this is because this image invokes the human experience to help it reach its target effect, but its target effect is not based in the human experience. That is, the target effect of this image is not to depict or comment on a facet of human experience or a scene of interplay between human emotions or to recontextualize a human perspective. The target effect of this image is to depict an objective, concrete phenomenon. Condition 2. The facet of human experience targeted must not be definite or concrete. Let's consider an account of the life of a child living in extreme poverty. The typical story used to illustrate the identifiable victim effect. Only this time, we strip the narrative of all emotional implications and present only the unadorned, concrete facts, among which the mental state of the child does not feature. Let's say she only gets one meal a day, toils from dawn till dusk, walks miles every day to access drinking water, and let's suppose we proceed thus to list out every concrete, physical, objective fact of her existence without including any abstract, subjective details like any expressions of emotion, anything showing the nature of her relationships with members of her family, etc. We can fill in the blanks as to those details ourselves, but when we do this, we create a new story, a story of our own imagination, which is only like the original insofar as the concrete details. From this modified story, we may glean depth, because the target effect of this story will be to depict a different aspect of the human experience from that which the original narrative seeks to depict. However, the original narrative, considered as it is barren of depth, though it depicts human experience. I believe that concrete fact contributes to depth only in the capacities of context or symbol, and that it can't directly constitute the aspect of human experience targeted by an instance of depth. I should also clarify that here I do not mean concrete in the strictly technical sense of tangible, but rather I use it in the sense of definite. Say if a creative work shows us two people looking at the same picture and one person sees a duck and the other sees a hare, That does not fulfill this condition because the creative work is depicting human perceptions, and this human perception isn't tangible, but the content of these perceptions is concrete, and thus the perceptions themselves are definite perceptions, which do not qualify. Condition 3. The depiction of the targeted aspect of human experience must feature at least one diagonal relationship between relevant ideas. Here, by relevant, I mean that the ideas in question must not be tangentially related to the depiction, and by diagonal, I mean that the relationship must not be too familiar to the observer to induce any exercise of conscious thought, or for the two related ideas to register as distinct. Familiarity is a state that tends almost universally to diminish striking effect, and thus I feel that this condition should be included. And because familiarity is subjective, this condition is that from which the subjective nature of depth stems. Taking the example of a depiction of a child in poverty, this time without disregarding the abstract aspects. If we were to contemplate, say, the typical portrayal of such a child as part of a solicitation for donations, this may sound cynical, but in that case, we know that the aim is to elicit sympathy for the child, and a uniformly pathetic, innocent, and ingenuous portrayal is seen as the most conducive to that end. The inclusion of any details incompatible with this portrayal is undesirable. In this case, I believe a diagonal relationship between ideas is hard to come by. If we consider the themes featured, what can we come up with? Childhood and innocence. The depiction does feature a relationship between the two, but it's not diagonal. Childhood and poverty, again, the relationship is not diagonal. In this case, the effects shown to result from the interaction between these two factors are too familiar to most audiences, prominently helplessness and despair. If somehow a less familiar set of effects resulting from the overlap of these factors was featured, then the relationship between these two factors could be the one that fulfills this condition. Alternatively, devising a less direct representation could also fulfill the need for a diagonal relationship, a metaphor, for instance. The point is that having some relevant diagonal relationship feature in the depiction is essential as it produces striking effect. Without this striking effect, no conscious appreciation of depth can take place, as the observer only absorbs an unremarkable sequence of information, and all the links between the constituents of that sequence suggest themselves to the mind so naturally and unthinkingly that no disruption from the resting state of indifference is produced. Even if the diagonal relationship is not featured in the depiction of human experience itself, an observer may, once again, fill in a diagonal relationship of their own, and in this way be struck by depth. For example, again considering the child in poverty, an observer may contemplate the child's situation with respect to their own, contrasting the relative complacency with which they regard their own life with the perpetual struggle faced by the child. And in this case, the relationship between those two ideas would be that they are both instances of human attitude towards survival. It's also interesting to note that merely considering the tangible, concrete differences in lifestyle, like access to electricity, water, etc., would not provide a suitable diagonal relationship because, as I said, the relationship must be between relevant ideas. I have enough food to eat, the child does not. I have clean water to drink, the child does not. Merely considering these statements together does not strike us with depth. When can depth be felt? I am not uncertain of my next meal, the child is. I take existence for granted. The child has no such luxury. These are ideas. The same principle, I believe, applies to all instances of depth. We may on occasion be struck by depth where only concrete phenomena seem to be involved, but upon closer inspection we will often find that the depth arises instead from human ideas which we associate with those concrete phenomena. However, there may still seem to be some cases that do not fit this theory, and to account for these cases we must investigate the type of depth that strikes us. And if I'm not mistaken altogether, it will turn out to be a type of depth different from that which we've discussed so far. The quality that we've discussed in this video is not the only one we call depth. There's also depth of thinking. Depth of thinking is exhibited when, for example, someone finds an exception to a principle or rule that many others take for granted, or when someone performs an elaborate, nuanced, and methodical analysis, breaking down an obscure concept into its constituents or revealing layers to it that may otherwise go unheeded. Even a video essay, which we may call deep, itself usually exhibits depth of thinking. The reason we may often conflate depth of thinking shown in a video essay with the depth arising from the human experience is that these two types of depth usually occur together in a video essay, which is to say that the depth of thinking shown by the essayist serves to illustrate, articulate, or explain the type of depth arising from the human experience, which is present in the media being analyzed. So we're exposed to both types of depth very closely interwoven. It's evident that the type of depth that strikes us immediately when we contemplate some maxim of wisdom from a great poet or philosopher is very different from the type of depth referred to when a video essayist writes deep analysis in the title. And indeed, depth of thinking is almost always found where there is depth arising from depicting the human experience, as it took a great deal of deep thinking to come up with the maxims of wisdom that great poets and philosophers espouse. Depth of thinking may even, perhaps, be a prerequisite for the depth we've discussed so far. However, the two are easily distinguished. When we feel a light dawning upon us, say after we've pondered the symbolic implications of a storytelling decision and finally come up with a definite answer, it means that if we find ourselves saying deep immediately afterwards, we have been struck by the depth of thinking on display in the work of art being considered. Say if we manage to decipher an elaborate metaphor framed by an author, we are usually struck by two impressions. The first impression is that of depth of thinking, which emerges from that aha moment when we finally strike upon the right explanation. The second, if it is present at all, is an impression of a different sort, which follows immediately. It arises from our realization of the metaphor's implications for the human experience, and that's rather a more sobering, moving, sublime sensation than the first. My theory is that the presence of these conditions is sufficient for depth to manifest, but that different instances of depth contain these three features in different ways and to different extents. Like say, for the first condition, a depiction of human experience may be more generalized or more accurate, and that leaves room for differences in degrees of depth. I know that the subject we've explored so far is highly subjective and inherently vague. I've probably overlooked many of the layers to this problem and I may have missed the mark entirely. What I've included in this video is far from a mathematical proof, but rather a theory based only on the strength of examples, which, to be fair, is really the best we can do when dealing with empirical phenomena as opposed to problems within the scope of mere logic. The very nature of the subject makes it so that even a single strong counterexample could refute these theories. But what can I say, it's in a video now. Let me know what you guys think. I'll see you all later. Bye for now.